Okay, now I've started to attach the front panel to the decorative panel to the lower hull section of the ship. Applied a liberal dose of gel super glue, found a good set of clamps and clamped it in place, and then I put it aside to dry. Now that those parts are drying, I went back to the rear and decided to go ahead and drill the hole for the photon launcher. I found the center, then went ahead and drilled a pilot hole, and we come back in and finished it out to the full size that it needed to be to incorporate the photon tube. Alright, I'm seeing a little issue here. I've got this detail piece for the end, and when I line it up to this side over here sits a bit too high. So there's two options here. I could either trim this trim piece down a bit, or I can adjust the shape of the hull, make just a fraction more room for this to sit in place. I believe we want to use that option because I don't want to lose any of this detail. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just trim this hole with my big file, make about a 1/16 of an inch more room, and it will be able to sit down in there properly then. Okay, now I'm back with this piece, and with very little trimming, it lays down on each side nicely. Just a little shaping, and I will be ready to glue in place. So now that I've got the hole drilled in the lower portion of the hull here, I went ahead and have glued in place the decorative piece that goes over the rear, clamped it well, and did this so it will help me when I'm placing the photon torpedo to make sure everything is aligned properly. So I just went ahead and glued it to the lower hull only, and you're going to let that set up, and then once it's set up, of course, I'm going to go back and putty and sand and blend it in well with the rest of the body. Okay, I've got this piece mounted now, but since it was basically cast flat and it fits on the ship at a diagonal, the bottom was not had an edge on it. Used my big file to take off the angle between this big piece and the base, and going to go back then and finish it up with some 220 sandpaper and some 600 grit. May have to put a little white putty in there also. And basically, if you can see this camera, even though it doesn't want to focus, at the back here, that is blended in pretty well with the file. Now I'm ready to go in and putty around the joint between the detail piece here and the hull. And in order to avoid getting any excess putty on either the detail on the bottom of the hull or on this detail piece along the back here, I've applied masking tape both to the hull and to the detail piece. That way I've got just this one little area here that needs to be filled with putty, and I can go back and sand it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to leave the tape on there till I get the sanding done too, to make sure I don't hit this area up here with any sandpaper when I'm trying to finish it. Okay, now here I am up by the disruptor bank on the lower hull, and as you can see, I've got blue masking tape around it. Actually, it's not for painting this time. I'm going to use my little saw blade and actually cut this piece off the model. The reason why I intend to light the rear of the disruptor nozzle here, if the camera would focus. Okay, that little disruptor nozzle there, I wanted to light it. So in order to do that, I've looked at other possibilities, and it's going to be very difficult to drill that out through the thick bottom plate here and be able to get the line in place without removing it. So I think the simplest solution is simply saw this off using my homemade hacksaw blade, configure the lighting, whether I'm going to use an SMD or fiber optic, get like a piece of 20 thou styrene to put back under it to get the height back to where it's supposed to be, and put the assembly and then glue the assembly back on after the provisions for lighting is in place. A lot of work and definitely not necessary unless this is just something you want to do, and in my case this is something that I want to try to accomplish, so I'm going through the extra steps to make it happen. Okay, and here's the part removed. The masking tape was to protect the surface of the ship, prevent the saw blade from doing any scratches. Again, I used my modified blue saw blade, just simply cut back there. I stopped at the little connector here, since this was actually one piece and that was like a separate piece. But now I've got this piece here free. I can go ahead and drill the holes as I want to, decide exactly how I want to go through this whole piece here to achieve my lighting, and it's going to make things a lot easier. Again, this is a unnecessary modification for most people. I just wanted to do it for my particular model here. It is a bit of work. It is quite a bit of sawing to get through that piece of resin, but in my case I wanted to do it, so I did. Alright, some of you may be wondering exactly how I'm cutting my styrene tubes, and I've went ahead and got a mark on this one. So I'm going to put it in my little tray and line the mark up on this one also. Right there. And then basically just go down through this tray. And there we go. That quick, that easy. Both cut to size. So this is what I'm going to be making the rear torpedo tube launcher out of. I'm going to use this to house the brass, and then this will slip inside there, which will hold a piece of acrylic. So I'm going to have the center LED and then the outer LED to simulate the firing of the charging of the torpedo and then the firing of the torpedo. Okay, and now what we've got here is I've got my Sharpie marker, which I already determined on the forward torpedo is the correct diameter for the copper, and I'm going to build the outer, since I don't have the long tube that I had with the clear cast part for the rear. I'm going to use this 1/2 inch tube to be the outer part, and I'm going to layer inside that the brass for the both light effect and reflection, and then use the 7/16 inch diameter to hold the clear acrylic and the for the torpedo effect, so I can put a lighted LED in the center of that and then cast another LED from the behind. But the problem is these tubes fit perfectly just like copper tubes do within one another when placed together. However, in this case I've got a piece of brass I'm going to be putting in between those two. So in order to do that, what I've done is I took and put a piece of sandpaper on my Sharpie and placed, it's just stuck in there, friction, and I've slid the tube over the top of that, and basically now I'm going to just hold this and spin it in order to enlarge the interior diameter of this plastic 1/2 inch tube just enough to allow the copper to go in. It just take a couple of minutes of turning, should remove enough material in there to provide adequate clearance for that copper. Okay, I've finished the torpedo tube. It's got the angle that it needs in order to mount and reflect the back of the ship. It's got the brass liner, and all I need to do now is place it and glue it in place. And the rear torpedo tube will be almost finished. I still have my smaller liner, plastic tube that has to go in there, that will hold the piece of acrylic, and then we'll have a rear tube ready. Okay, it didn't take long at all with my little hacksaw tool. I was just able to go in there, slice that thing right off. Now I'm going to adjust the inner block, which is in the base here. So I've begun the drilling of the torpedo hole, and you kind of see the problem there. So I'm going to be reducing this block by about half, getting rid of that rear section where that second pin would go. Okay, a little more work with my hacksaw tool, and now we have plenty of room between the rear of the photon torpedo and the first block with the pin. I also left a little of the resin at the base for a little extra structural reinforcement, but hopefully this has not weakened the structure any. The resin for this lower hull section is relatively thick, as you can see from this side panel here, so I don't believe we're going to have any kind of structure issues because of this. And it does give me plenty of room to be able to go in there and add the photon launcher for the rear. Alright, today I'm going to work on some fiber optics, and what I've got here is a 5mm LED. I took my file and filed the top off of this to where it was flat. The only reason for that is it's difficult to drill on the top of that rounded LED, so this just made it easier. You could went in and stuck it with a pin and went incrementally through different size drill bits and done the same thing without having to file that off. But I did. Either way works. The thing about these LEDs is, as long as you stay out of the electronic portion here, the plastic encapsulated portion is not important. So once I got it flat, I went back in and did put a center start there, and then I used a drill bit that was as large as the bundle of fibers I wanted to use, and drilled out a hole into this LED. Now what I've actually got is the loose fibers here. There's 9 of them in this particular case. And you want to take those and get one set of the ends as straight as possible. Kind of get them in a row, and then what I like to do is take and clip these ends again as straight as possible. Because ideally you don't want any angle. You want these to be as flat as possible. Then once I've got these clipped to length, I'm going to kind of form a round bundle with them and put a band around them. Rubber band, whatever kind of band you got handy, to kind of help hold these together. And you want them pretty tight. At least this is the way I do it. Sure, there's other ways, probably better ways. Okay, so now these are kind of bunched up. They're not perfect, but they are being held together in a bundle. I want to go back, and the surface of this may be dirty, but these scissors are pretty clean. So I want to go back and align the bottoms of these up again to make sure that they're all basically the same length. Okay, now that I've got these ends aligned, I've got my LED with a hole in it. I'm going to put this LED, or put these fibers inside this LED. Make sure they're all in there. And as you can see, the hole was sized to where it's tight enough that it's actually able to hold that LED on with just the tension from the fibers themselves. Of course, that's not the way I'm going to actually attach this. I'm going to mix up some clear 5-minute epoxy. I've got the Quick Cure 5-minute and resin part A and hardener part B. And we'll go ahead and mix that up and I'll be back in just a minute. Okay, I'm stirring up the epoxy. I'm stirring out for a minute or so now. I want to mix thoroughly. This is actually far more epoxy I'm going to need. I'm going to need just a drop. But anyway, this is how much I mixed. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pull this off and back to the top of this LED. I'm going to just fill it with epoxy. Now I'm going back with my fibers. And I'm going to place it inside the LED. Turn it up to where it's all there. All the fibers are in. Since I got plenty, I'm going to go ahead and put just a little more on the outside. It's not really necessary. But there's plenty of resin to coat the LED and keep the fibers bound together tightly in this little bundle. Now all I need to do is set it aside to let it dry. And see if I can get me a napkin here. And just set it down to where it's level. And let the epoxy cure. Okay, back on the little fiber optic project. I've got my fibers here that I've epoxied in there. I went ahead and attached the positive lead of the diode, a 470 ohm resistor, which makes this capable of running at 12 volts. And of course it will illuminate at lower voltages, but 12 volts is what it's actually set up for. I've got to put a couple of pigtails on it, and I just tried it, and it does indeed work. I don't know if that's focusing or not, but that's the ends of all the LEDs, and this is the bulb. Now, I did put one large piece of heat shrink over the two heat shrinks that I put over the individual legs of the LED. I don't want any chance of those shorting, so they were covered individually with some small heat shrink, and it was shrunk down. One was shrunk down over the leg and the resistor, and another larger piece was shrunk down over the entire array. Now I'm going to go back with a piece of this red heat shrink and encapsulate that. And since it's going to be inside the ship, it won't be seen, but just for neatness sake, I'm going to go ahead and do it.